Hello everybody. I'm going to get the light shifted over here a little bit, just a tad, so I can blind myself as I do this. We're going to play a psychometric test today, so when we look at the find measure assignment, this is going to turn out to be kind of useful. As I discussed in our Zoom today, this morning, this is much of what we've learned in psychology is about psychometric tests. It's been something that's probably been touched on in most of our courses, that some kind of survey instruments or tests have been discussed. So we're going to talk about psychometric tests in this module, and then later on we're going to talk about validity and reliability. So your find and measure paper should be supported by these assignments. This is critical to understanding. This is, you know, operationalizing constructs. So when we did the activity of selecting high performers versus low performers, and then we looked at the constructs that really separated them, that we could array on a bipolar continuum, what we're doing is identifying qualities that we believe are important, and the psychometric test part now is to find tests or develop tests that allow us to operationalize those constructs, to measure them, and develop, you know, scores that allow us to rank order our applicants. So that's what we're about, and that's where we're going to go here. So 5 basics of psychometric tests. We need a definition of tests. We're going to talk about work sample, analogous tests versus psychometric analytic tests, when not to use psychometric tests, types of psychometric tests, and how we choose between tests. So definition of tests, these are carefully chosen, systematic, standardized procedures that are for evoking a sample of response from a candidate, which are evaluated and quantifiable, and that's the big deal, is quantifiable. Let's generate a number, right? That are fair and consistent. So that's what we're about. Rosie's going to sit in here with us on this one. So there's Rosie, right, sweetie? I think she just wants to sleep. She doesn't want to be pet. So let's just move on. So carefully chosen, systematic, well-crafted. We want well-crafted, demonstrating reliability, validity, and fairness. Tests that have been used in peer-reviewed articles, right, or tests themselves that are the basis of an article, often in its first presentation or testing the test, so to speak. This is where the empirical validation occurs. The scientists, psychometricians, if you will, and that's the fancy term for people who do psychometrics. They demonstrate the test. People then use the test in various experiments and create numbers that demonstrate the test reliability, validity, and fairness within an occupational context, if those numbers have been calculated and if they match. So they follow standardized procedures, identical tasks, identical instructions, identical settings, and identical evaluations. So when we do laboratory research, you know, and this is why social psychologists like laboratory research so much, is we can control the environment. We can control all aspects of the experimental process. And we should try to emulate this when we're giving psychometric tests to job candidates. It should be given at the same point in time in the process. It should be under the same conditions, ideally in the same location, so that we can rely on the score from the test as being as objective and as uncontaminated as possible. So the evaluation of these tests is usually based on a large enough sample of similar people to validate the tests. So many tests suggest that 19 items to reliably establish a candidate's standing on any given trait domain. But notice this is a very general rule of thumb. This is not, in fact, just cast in stone. Different tests might, in fact, have different number of items and might be useful or not in that regard. Many other psychologists, especially nasty social psychologists, will establish differences between participants using far fewer questions depending on what it is we're trying to measure. But there are usually, when we get to that, the fewer number of questions are often accomplished via behavioral measures rather than trait level measures. But remember, we really prefer to go to kind of behavioral measures rather than trait measures, because it's behaviors we want to predict, it's skills we want to predict, it's abilities we want to assess, So usually less items are necessary to do that. When we talk about something that's more nebulous, like a trait, like extroversion, then we might need more questions to establish that. But notice that traits are usually less predictive of performance on the job than behavioral measures would be. So, a further aside on the number of questions, you know, psychologists, believe it or not, yeah, might thus appear to disagree on what's useful and what's not, and that's no big surprise. The text also mentions the ability tests tend to use even more questions, up to 50. One of the favorite tests in the Petty Lab, the study of attitudes that was developed out of the Petty Lab, is like need for cognition. And this was important to understand persuasion. One of the keys to persuasion was understanding if the person, the target person, likes to think or not, and that's need for cognition. If I'm not mistaken, this is like a 21-item scale. But people argue. When I was, working with Derek Rucker and he was in the Petty Lab, he always wanted to use need for cognition in our research, and it was like a 21-item scale, and it can really lengthen an experiment when you've already asked someone 30 or 40 questions, now to hit them with another 21. Jokingly, one time I took the need for cognition scale out to 21 items and just used a single item, how much do you like to think? It predicted with the same level of reliability as the 21-item scale, but doesn't have the support, the empirical support in the literature. So that's something that we have to consider. The general trend would be from fewest to greatest number of questions, and if we can go back to something that's an observable, quantifiable behavior, we're probably better off than using trait-type constructs or personality dimensions. Right? And then we get to that issue of abilities, and Han was asking what's the difference between skills and ability. In this morning's Zoom chat, and there's a lot of overlap there. So skills and abilities. Skills, though, are things that we can demonstrate. Abilities might be more akin to potential that has not yet been realized necessarily. So the ability to learn, right, can be demonstrated behaviorally, if we wanted to, by giving someone when it's clear they don't know how to do something, and then we give them instructions, and then we observe their performance afterwards, we might be able to gauge ability to learn in kind of a behavioral setting that way. Someone here wants to say hello, so Proton's just being wacky here. Proton doesn't like to be held too much, though. It's funny. Electron loves to be held, Proton not so much, although she's pretty. Proton. And she's so little. Look at that. Okay, so that is in fact Archie's sister, Mercer, just in case you were wondering, and she's tiny. Right? So, work sample versus psychometric test. Work sample test, behaviors actually performed on the job, or at least as closely as possible. And I'll go back to, hey, if we're hiring a teacher, one thing we should do is take some work samples. Potential work samples is, hey, what is a favorite assignment that you've constructed? Or give me an example of 3 different assignments. Supply the assignments and supply as part of the work sample the intention of the assignment, the lead into the assignment, what the assignment is supposed to demonstrate, and maybe distribution of scores that students have achieved on that assignment. So we're talking work sample, or we might have someone come in and give 10 minutes of a lecture. This would be a work sample test. Notice these are then 1-item or 2-item tests, rather than trying to understand what traits a person possesses, like let's develop this trait measure of, oh, communication skill. Well, yeah, we can do that, and it's kind of nebulous, and maybe it predicts something on the job or not. But if we actually ask people to communicate, that is, deliver a lecture or develop an agenda for a meeting, might be another thing if we're looking at managerial candidates, that we look at actual behaviors. And these will predict largely better, although they might not be empirically supported, which is another issue. Now, notice with the work sample test, though, it's going to have a kind of a narrow range of use. So we'll probably have to develop far more of these, more specific to positions that we're assessing the candidate's potential for, or their skills for, rather than more generic testing items. But they can be really accurate in their ability to assess actual person specifications. So it's probably pretty obvious that I have a pretty strong preference for behavioral kind of tests rather than more generic kind of trait level tests. So then the work sample, right? The psychometric test can attempt to assess fundamental characteristics of the applicant, and that's fine. And but again, if we're going to be more specific, I think the work sample test is probably better. Now, psychometrics certainly more generalizable across a wider range of person specifications, but it might not be as effective in predicting. So there's trade-offs, and these are things you'll have to consider. Do we want to go with kind of this broad trait type test that might clue us into behavior across a wide variety of situations for the applicant, or like conscientiousness? Part of Big Five is conscientiousness, right? Well, is the person conscientious? That is, can we rely on them to get their tasks done? And we can use that portion of the Big Five to assess a person's level of conscientiousness and hope that it predicts conscientiousness on the job. Or we can give people maybe interview questions that say, talk about how important it is how important is it for you to get something done well and get it done on time, and can you give me an example of when this happened? Or we can actually craft tasks that they have to do that might demonstrate their conscientiousness for that task. Okay? So the psychometric tests, though, are designed to test characteristics that underlie the behavior. So do we want to look at what underlies the behavior, or do we want to look at the behavior? Again, this is something for you to consider and understand when you're selecting a test, the trade-offs, right? So psychometric tests that test this underlying trait that affects the observed behavior, right, isn't measuring the actual behavior, and that's a big point. So when not to use psychometric tests, well, if you're assessing impact on others or interpersonal skills, maybe you want to go to a group exercise, right, rather than a psychometric test. When I got hired at Boise Cascade, and I was one of 60 people who was put through the ringer where they eventually hired 15 of us, I remember one aspect of the testing, and it was a 2-day ordeal. It was kind of silly. And I found out later that they weren't testing people to be forklift drivers, etc. The consulting firm actually said that these tests are really designed to assess leadership skills, which made no sense at all, to hire people into union kind of fixed promotion ladder positions and then, you know, kind of array us on leadership skills. But I remember one of the behavioral tests that was an interpersonal test. It was kind of scary at the moment. You know, I needed this job. The chips are really on the line, and they said, okay, so what we're going to do now is, and they had us broken into groups of, I believe it was 8 or 9. They said, we need to solve this puzzle. And the puzzle, it was one of those analytic things like you might find on the GRE. That is, here's a baseball team, and they start, you know, we get this list of information. The second baseman, sister is related to the first baseman. Oh, and it just went on down the line. And the ultimate goal was, with all these stupid pieces of information, we were then to make a list of who played which position and then fill in the details from there. Well, I looked at this and I said, oh my God, I do not want to be embedded in the middle of 8, 9 people arguing about this. This is just, you know, going to be a nightmare. But I scanned the room, and what's standing there? There was a flip chart and there was a handful of markers. So what I did is I stood up, I went up to the flip chart, and I grabbed one of the markers and said, hey guys, what do you think? How about you all just toss out your points, and I can record them on the sheet here for us to look at, and that went well for me. But notice it's a behavior that's observed interpersonally. Who's going to get up and coordinate people's ideas? And that's kind of how that was scored, right? So group exercise was predictive in this case of leadership abilities. I don't think it was appropriate to the position they were hiring for, which was a forklift driver. Regardless, if you want to assess impact, interpersonal skills, then it's probably best to put people in a group type setting, and you know, the difficulties of developing a rubric that makes sense of the behaviors you're observing. You might put people into role play, and this is, you know, pretend that you have a customer who's angry, and then, you know, one of the interviewers takes the part of the customer, and then we observe how the person behaves, and we can have a scoreable rubric. What are all the components of they did? Did they listen clearly? Did they give the person enough time to voice their complaint? Did they paraphrase the complaint back to the person? So we can take critical or effective listening skills, and we can turn them into kind of check off the box measures that we would apply to a role play. Notice this gives us a rich amount of information, more so than maybe kind of this very esoteric trait type test. And so that's why we would tend to not use psychometric tests under these circumstances. If oral communication is important to the position, then have people craft a presentation. Have people engage in the role play once again, or do meeting and group interviews. And for a lot of clinical psych programs, you see that's kind of becoming the thing that they do. Now, further, when not to use psychometric tests? Well, if it's about physical ability, let's then assess physical ability, right? And let's do it directly. Notice the PAQ, among other existing instruments, gives us a lot of ideas and a lot of utility in how to assess physical performance opportunities. Also with physical ability might be a health screening. Right? Operating equipment, let's do a physical demonstration. If I'm applying as a forklift driver and I have experience as a forklift driver, then let's put me on a forklift and see if I can move a pallet from one place to another safely. Right? And then operating equipment, there might be possible attainment style tests too, and this would be regarding licensing, etc., and various qualifications that have been achieved. Now, if we're thinking about assessing someone on their strategic thinking, their planning ability, we might look at their work history or their written work and ask for people to provide us examples. And this can be examples that they pre-prepare and are directed to bring in, and then we discuss the examples with folks, or we can have them on the fly, right? Give them a rubric, so to speak, or give them an assignment and have them complete it in-house while we're watching or what have you. And then experience, qualifications, education. We don't need to test someone on their mental abilities. What we can do is ask for transcripts, right? Or we can ask for references, although references tend to be a tad unreliable. Okay. So when not to use psychometric tests. But let's think about, okay, sometimes we will use psychometric tests. How do we go about that? So we might look at sensory motor facility and abilities. We might look at sensory acuity, that is the precision. Right? We might then want to assess mental ability. And we can use attainment tests that we can measure what's been learned. We can assess present performance. We can give people problems to solve, you know, like straight out of the SAT or the GRE. The problem, we can top out on some tests in some cases, that is, if we have a restriction of range, which is a term we'll use in subsequent modules, we might not be able to differentiate candidates if everyone does well on the test. Aptitude ability tests, they measure potential and they predict future performance and perhaps trainability. It's kind of an issue we've discussed. These tests are more difficult to administer and probably a little less reliable in predicting future performance. The more global the tests become, then the more we may be straying from reliably predicting future behavior on specific tasks within the job. So ability is thought to be more general, global than aptitude, right? So general intelligence, adequate measures if we want to measure someone's intelligence, although I can't necessarily know why we would want to do this in most employment situations. There's so much, there's so many more areas that would be useful. But we can, you know, give people intelligence tests if we so desire. We can use work samples that involve reasoning and or judgment, so they can provide those. Or situational questions that tap into reasoning and analysis. One example of a work sample test in this regard might be if we're hiring an academic into a research position. Well, then we can ask them to present their research, that is, published articles, if you will. And if it's an entry level, then they might not have any kind of published research articles, but they might have a master's thesis or a dissertation that one can look at. We can ask situational questions that tap into reasoning and analysis. So we can craft some situation that maybe SMEs have encountered for this position. We work backwards from what the SMEs discussed as something that they do in that position. And then we can develop a situational question that taps into those qualities. Okay. Other psychometric tests might be straight up numerical ability. We might, a simple test, well, back in the day, I don't know if it's so important anymore, maybe to a certain extent, but one of the first jobs I had was at Baker's Tacos, and I loved that stupid job. It was working in the kind of this independent little fast food dive, and we did everything from making all the food to cleaning the place up to handling the register, and just two of us would work at a time. I don't know why I loved that job, but I did. And it's like using the cash register. Back then the cash register, didn't tell you how much change there was. So you had to be able to compute change, right? And that would be a pretty easy test to do, right? You could say, hey, out of $1, the price is 68, how much change do you give? 32, right? 47.53, and see what facility a person has, and that would be easy to score, as you can see. We can test spatial ability, verbal ability, mechanical reasoning, and specific occupational tests. Let's stop for a sec. We'll go to part 2.